President Donald Trump signed the Border Infrastructure National Security Directive on Monday in Washington, declaring 26 border crossings to be national security assets and using the move to pressure Canada as both governments face a $400 billion trade relationship now under strain. The directive frames border infrastructure as a security issue rather than a routine trade matter, giving the White House a new lever in a dispute that has quickly moved from policy language to political confrontation. The administration's argument is straightforward. Crossings, inspection routes, and related transport corridors are not just commercial infrastructure, but strategic assets tied to supply chains, customs enforcement, and national defense. By placing 26 crossings under that umbrella, Trump is signaling that border access can be treated as a bargaining tool, not just a logistics question. In practical terms, that approach puts Canada directly in the middle of a U.S. security-first trade strategy. The timing matters because the U.S.-Canada trade relationship covers roughly $400 billion in annual commerce, with autos, energy, agriculture, and industrial goods all moving across the border every day. Any policy that changes how crossings are managed can ripple through trucking, manufacturing, and customs operations within hours. Business groups have already warned that even limited disruptions could raise costs and slow shipments on both sides of the border. Trump has long argued that border infrastructure should be treated as a matter of sovereignty and leverage, not just maintenance and administration. Supporters of the directive say it gives Washington a stronger hand in negotiations and a way to force compliance on security priorities. Critics, however, say the move blurs the line between national defense and economic coercion, especially when the targets are close allies and deeply integrated supply chains. Inside Congress, the reaction was immediate and uneasy, with lawmakers from both parties beginning to question how far the administration can go under the new directive. Several aides said the language of the order raised legal and diplomatic concerns within hours of the signing. Congressional alarm spreads within hours. Legal scholars, automakers, and farm groups warned Tuesday that the directive could run headlong into the Constitution's Commerce Clause, disrupt tightly synchronized North American supply chains, and turn bridge access into a political weapon against the U.S. economy itself. Their criticism is simple. If border crossings are treated like bargaining chips, the costs do not stay at the border. Several constitutional experts said the order raises immediate legal questions because the federal government can regulate interstate and foreign commerce, but cannot use that power to arbitrarily choke off trade flows without triggering court challenges. One senior trade lawyer described the move as a stress test for executive authority, arguing that any policy deliberately designed to slow commerce would face scrutiny from judges asked to decide whether security language is being used as cover for economic coercion. Automakers were among the first to sound the alarm, and for good reason. The North American auto industry runs on just-in-time delivery, with parts crossing the border multiple times before a vehicle is finished. And even short delays can ripple through assembly lines within hours. Industry executives warned that if crossings are slowed, plants in Michigan, Ontario, and Mexico could be forced to idle workers, miss shipping deadlines, and absorb higher logistics costs almost immediately. Farm groups delivered a similar warning, saying the directive could hit grain, livestock, and produce shipments that depend on predictable border processing. According to agricultural trade associations, perishable goods move on narrow timelines, and any added inspection burden or administrative delay can spoil loads, raise fuel costs, and push buyers toward other suppliers. Their message was blunt. When Washington plays games with bridges, rural exporters do not get a second chance. Business lobbyists said the policy risks weaponizing infrastructure that supports both countries' economies, not just one government's negotiating position. They argued that crossings are not symbolic props and that treating them as leverage could create retaliation, insurance problems, and a broader chill in cross-border investment. In their view, the order does not project strength so much as advertise instability, which is exactly what supply chains hate most. The legal fight could move fast if lawsuits are filed, with challengers likely to argue that the directive exceeds executive authority and interferes with commerce in a way the Constitution does not permit. Courts would then have to weigh national security claims against the practical reality that border infrastructure is embedded in a $400 billion trade system that cannot simply be paused without consequences. That tension, lawyers said, is where the administration could find itself on shaky ground. Warren Buffett then stepped in with a blunt warning. Warren Buffett has warned that the proposed border directive could backfire on the U.S. economy, calling it self-destructive, as factory operators in Michigan, Texas, Ohio, and other border-linked states brace for delays, shutdown risk, and higher costs. His warning lands at a moment when even a short disruption in cross-border traffic could hit auto plants, logistics hubs, and agricultural processors within hours. Buffett's criticism is landing hard because the policy is not some abstract Washington stunt. It reaches straight into the industrial corridors that depend on predictable movement of parts, freight, and workers. And those corridors run through states that can ill afford a sudden shock. In Michigan and Ohio, automakers are already watching for missed deliveries and idle shifts, while Texas and border states face the possibility that slower crossings will jam ports of entry and ripple into warehouse operations. The pressure point is simple. Modern manufacturing does not wait around for political theater. A single delayed shipment can stall an assembly line, and a few stalled lines can quickly turn into lost outputs, overtime costs, and layoffs that spread beyond one plant. Executives and trade analysts say the risk is especially acute in the auto sector, where components cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. Texas is exposed for a different reason, and that is volume. The state handles a massive share of U.S.-Mexico trade, and any policy that slows bridge traffic or adds uncertainty to inspections can hit trucking, warehousing, and export schedules at once. Border communities, already used to operating at full tilt, would be the first to feel the squeeze if carriers start rerouting or holding loads instead of taking the usual path. Ohio and Michigan, meanwhile, are getting hit through the industrial backdoor. Their factories rely on synchronized supply chains that stretch across North America. And those networks are built on the assumption that customs processing stays stable. If that assumption breaks, plant managers do not get a political debate, they get a production problem. And production problems become payroll problems. Fast. Buffett's intervention matters because he rarely speaks in the language of partisan drama. When he calls a policy self-destructive, investors hear a warning about capital, not just politics. And that tends to carry more weight on trading desks than a press release ever could. His message is basically, if the government turns trade routes into leverage, the bill comes due at home. That is why business groups are now talking less about rhetoric and more about immediate exposure. They point to lost hours at the border, higher insurance costs, and the possibility that companies will start building in delays as a permanent expense. Once that happens, the damage does not stay confined to one crossing or one sector. It spreads through pricing, hiring, and investment decisions across the Midwest and the South. Republican lawmakers, many of whom initially stayed quiet, are now beginning to revolt in Congress. 17 Republican senators, and later 21, joined Democrats on Thursday to block the order, after Senate Democratic Whip Catherine Cortez Masto led the push with a hard number case that turned the chamber's attention from slogans to trade exposure. The Nevada Democrat argued that the directive was not just a border fight, but a direct threat to billions of dollars in cross-border commerce, and enough Republicans decided they did not want their names attached to that mess. Cortez Masto's challenge centered on the scale of the fallout. She and her allies pointed to the 26 crossings covered by the order, the roughly $400 billion in annual U.S.-Mexico trade that runs through them, and the immediate risk to auto, agriculture, and freight operations if inspections slowed or traffic was rerouted. In Washington terms, that was the moment the spin stopped working and the receipts started talking. By the time the vote came down, the rebellion had widened beyond the first 17 GOP defections. 4 more Republicans crossed over, pushing the total to 21 and giving Democrats the margin they needed to stop the measure. In the Senate, a result that underscored how quickly business pressure can turn into legislative trouble when the numbers get ugly enough. Republicans who broke ranks did not frame it as a dramatic ideological conversion. They talked about jobs, supply chains, and the basic problem of using border infrastructure as a pressure tool against a major trading partner. In other words, the Senate was not buying the gaslighting that this was some clean national security move, when the likely effect was higher costs for American companies and workers. The vote also exposed a familiar split inside the GOP. One camp wanted to stand with the White House and treat the directive as a show of force. The other camp looked at the trade data and saw a political stunt with a price tag. That split mattered because it showed the order was no longer just facing outside criticism from economists and lawyers. It was now leaking support from inside the president's own coalition. Cortez Masta's office leaned hard on the economic argument, and it worked because the numbers were hard to wave away. Trade groups had already warned that even a short slowdown at the border could jam delivery schedules, raise shipping costs, and force companies to absorb delays they cannot simply pass on without consequence. Once those figures hit the floor, the debate stopped being abstract and started sounding like a balance sheet problem. For Democrats, the Senate vote was the first clear institutional check on the order. For Republicans, it was a warning that the policy was not holding together under scrutiny, and especially once lawmakers from manufacturing and border states started hearing from employers, growers, and logistics firms. The message was blunt. If this was supposed to be a power play, it was already turning into a liability. Now the fight is moving out of the Senate and into the courts, where state attorneys general are preparing to take the next shot. 7 states filed a legal brief on Wednesday challenging the administration's border directive, while Congress moved to pass the Border Commerce Protection Act, shifting the fight from executive reach to constitutional limits in Washington and the federal courts. The new front is straightforward: whether the White House can use border infrastructure as a trade weapon, or whether the Constitution still draws a line. The brief, backed by attorneys general from 7 states, argues that the order exceeds presidential authority and intrudes on powers reserved to Congress and the states. Plaintiffs say the directive is not just a policy dispute, but a structural test of the Commerce Clause, with state governments warning that any attempt to slow cross-border traffic would hit employers, ports, and tax revenue before it ever produced diplomatic leverage. Congress answered with speed. The Border Commerce Protection Act, introduced as a direct countermeasure, would bar the executive branch from restricting commercial border crossings without explicit legislative approval. A move supporters described as a necessary guardrail after the Senate vote exposed how fragile the order had become. Lawmakers backing the bill said the issue is no longer about messaging. It is about whether one branch can unilaterally rewrite the rules of trade. The legislation advanced with unusual cross-party interest, reflecting pressure from manufacturers, agricultural groups, and logistics firms that had spent weeks warning about delays, rerouted freight, and higher costs. Several members framed the bill as a constitutional cleanup job, not a political slap fight. And that distinction mattered in a chamber where even some Republicans were no longer eager to defend a policy that looked increasingly like a self-inflicted bruise. Legal scholars said the case now turns on a narrow but consequential question: whether border crossings can be treated as national security infrastructure in a way that overrides ordinary commerce. Protections. That argument is headed straight into familiar territory for the courts, where judges will likely weigh emergency authority against the long-standing principle that trade regulation belongs primarily to Congress, not the Oval Office. For the states, the brief is also a warning shot. Attorneys general say the order would create uneven burdens across border economies, with some states absorbing immediate disruption while others face spillover costs through supply chains, warehouse bottlenecks, and transportation contracts. In practical terms, the lawsuit is asking the court to stop what state officials call a federal overreach before it becomes a permanent operating model. Canada, for its part, responded with restrained defiance. Officials in Ottawa said they would not mirror the escalation, but they made clear that any attempt to punish cross-border commerce would draw a legal and economic response. Not a quiet retreat. The message was delivered without theatrics, which in this fight may have been the sharpest move of all. Canada responded in a short, measured statement on Thursday, declining to match Washington's move while warning that any disruption to cross-border commerce would be answered through legal and economic channels, not theater. The White House directive that tried to recast border bridges as leverage against Ottawa is now running into the same two walls that stop most overreach in America: Congress and the market. Warren Buffett effectively closed the book on the bilateral bridges argument earlier in the week, calling the idea of using trade infrastructure as a pressure point a losing proposition for both countries. His warning was blunt. If a policy damages the flow of goods, it does not create leverage so much as it creates self-inflicted costs, and those costs show up first in factories, ports, and payrolls. That is where the directive started to unravel. Freight operators, automakers, growers, and logistics firms had already flagged delays and rerouting risks, and lawmakers quickly translated those warnings into legislative action. The Border Commerce Protection Act, now moving through Congress, would block the executive branch from restricting commercial crossings without explicit approval. A provision supporters say is less about politics than about restoring a basic boundary between presidential power and trade policy. The legal fight is moving just as fast. The 7-state brief filed against the order argues that the directive crosses into territory reserved for Congress and the states, and that emergency language cannot be used to rewrite the Commerce Clause by decree. Judges are expected to focus on whether border infrastructure can be treated as national security hardware in a way that overrides ordinary trade rules, a test that could narrow presidential discretion well beyond this case. In Washington, the resistance is no longer theoretical. The Senate vote exposed how thin the coalition behind the directive had become, and the House is now weighing a companion response with unusual bipartisan interest. Several lawmakers describe the issue as a constitutional cleanup, not a partisan score-settling exercise, because the practical stakes are immediate. Shipping schedules, contract penalties, warehouse bottlenecks, and higher costs for companies on both sides of the border. Ottawa's response also matters because it removes the fantasy that this was ever a one-sided bluff. Canadian officials signaled they would not retaliate in kind, but they made clear that any attempt to weaponize crossings would meet a coordinated response through courts, regulators, and trade channels. That restraint stripped the directive of the drama it needed, leaving the policy looking less like hardball and more like a bad edit that never made it past the first screening. The economic math is doing the rest. Businesses that depend on predictable border movement have little appetite for a policy that turns infrastructure into a bargaining chip, and investors tend to punish uncertainty faster than politicians can spin. Once that reality set in, the directive stopped looking like leverage and started looking like a liability. For now, the precedent is bigger than the order itself. Even if the directive survives in some narrowed form, the response from Congress, the states, the courts, and Canada has already established the line it tried to erase. The precedent now outlives the order.